In this lecture and the next one, we're going to take a look at some of the aspects of how the United States' economy and society were transformed in the period from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to the beginning of World War I in 1914. In 1865, the United States' economy and society would have appeared to be pretty much of a foreign country to most modern Americans. But by 1914, many of the aspects that we now take for granted as part of the world that we live in were already in place. In this period, the U.S. economy went from being a predominantly agricultural society, predominantly agricultural economy, to being a predominantly urban industrialized economy and society. Transformation from rural to urban. In 1865, the United States was still overwhelmingly rural. In the 1920 census, for the first time in American history, more Americans lived in towns and cities than the number that lived on farms in small towns and villages in rural areas. At the beginning of this period, the major raw material, the major ingredient to industrial society was iron. At the end of the period, iron had been replaced to a large extent by steel. We went from railroads and horses for transportation rapidly to autos and trucks by the middle by 1914, 1920. We went from the telegraph to the telephone. Major form of inanimate power at the beginning of this period was steam. By the end of this period, we were rapidly replacing steam with electricity and products from oil. And in terms of structure, in terms of how we produce things in this country, we went from overwhelmingly producing things on farms, in craft shops, in small businesses, to producing more and more of what we consumed were being produced by large corporations. Beside the transformation, the U.S. economy had become much larger. In fact, by 1914, the United States was the largest industrial economy in the world. We already had about 1/3 of the world's total manufacturing capacity. By 1900, the United States had already overtaken England as the #1 producer in the traditional areas that England had the lead in most of the 19th century, areas like production of coal, iron and steel, and even cotton textiles. By 1914, the United States had over half of, well, about half of the world's railroad track. We had over half of the electricity produced in the entire world, and the United States produced about 3/4 of all the cars and trucks produced in the world. So we had become a large, dominant industrial society. The U.S. economy had been transformed by technological innovation and rapid industrial growth. We not only had become larger, however, but the whole structure of the economy in the United States had changed. Pieces of the economy, some of the industries I've been talking about, some of the industries I'll be talking about today, had become part of an industrial system. The pieces had come together to form much of the modern economy, the kind of world that we live in today, that we take for granted today. They had helped form much of the kind of urban environment and, by extension, suburban environment that we live in today. So we're going to take a look to see some of the reasons, not all certainly, it's obviously complex transformation. We're going to take a look at some of the reasons why this occurred. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the supply side. We're going to take a look at some of the technological innovations and some of the organizational changes that occurred, and then, of course, some of the consequences of those changes that help explain the kind of world we live in today. What I would like to do is to quickly take a look at three new industries that began after the Civil War that helped transform the world we live in. And those three industries were steel, petroleum, the oil industry, and electricity. So we start with steel, which is really the basic raw material of the modern industrial society. Now, what had happened was that even before the Civil War is that new technology, new discoveries had already begun to transform the iron industry. New ways to make iron, and what happened was these discoveries in fact led to a different product, to steel. Steel is made from iron ore. It's made from, in fact, it's made from iron, just like wrought iron or cast iron is. The big difference is that it has a carbon content about halfway between wrought iron and cast iron, and it has some of the good features of both tied up together. Like many of the other basic technologies of the 19th century, the basic discoveries and developments were done in England. The basic ways to produce steel, and then some of the improvements that made it commercially feasible were developed and patented in England. American companies were very quick to realize that there was some real good commercial potential here to make this new product. And American companies tried to license the patents held by the English discoverers of the new processes. The most famous one, which you may have heard of, was developed by a man named Henry Bessemer, as the Bessemer process. Groups of Americans did buy rights to the patents. Mr. Bessemer, later Sir Henry Bessemer, got rich by selling patent rights, not producing steel, and many of those patent rights were sold to Americans. But what happened was, again, this typical American story. Americans buy or bring over new technology and then rapidly adapt it to American conditions and rapidly improve it to increase productivity. The first steel mills were put up in the early 1870s using, again, English technology, English patents. By 1880, the average American steel mill was already producing twice as much steel, was twice as large as the average English steel mill. Now, in the production of steel, there are large economies of scale, which means basically that the larger your production unit is, larger your capacity is, the lower your unit cost is. This only works, of course, if you can run a lot of raw material through the mill. You can produce, in this case, a lot of steel. One of the reasons for economies of scale is because in steel production and a number of the other industries coming in at this time, there are large upfront costs. You have to buy a lot of capital, buy a lot of fixed assets in order to get into business. And then, of course, you have to run a lot of product through the mill in order to spread your fixed cost over a high volume of production. If you can do that, then you will have low unit cost. The other thing you can do, and what happened in the steel industry in America during the last quarter of the 19th century, was this continuous improvement in the basic production processes. So not only were there lower costs because of higher volume, economies of scale, but the production process itself became more efficient, more productive. So unit costs continue to fall for that reason also in the United States. Now, in the early years, steel production was closely associated with the railroad industry. The main product, by far, of the early years of the steel mills was to produce rails. Why rails? Well, the main reason was steel rails lasted longer than rails made out of iron. And replacing rails was very expensive, so that the railroads had a vested interest in having rails, once they put them down, having them be there a long time. Originally, steel rails lasted about 5 to 7 times as long as iron rails. Later on, as the quality improved, some studies show they lasted as much as 10 to 15 times as long as iron rails. Steel rails in the 1870s cost about 50% more than iron rails, so they were used for replacement. If you're going to replace an iron rail, you might as well put a steel one in there. But there still was a market for iron rails as original equipment. Why? Because they were cheaper. However, by 1883, because of improvements in productivity in the steel mills, is that the price of steel rails had actually fallen to below that of iron rails. And of course, by that point, steel rails took over the entire market. So the first product, the first use of the steel that was being produced in these new mills was as a substitute. Steel rails were being substituted for iron rails. The man who was most closely associated with this whole process is Andrew Carnegie, who had in the past a close association with the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. In fact, was already wealthy before he started doing this. Got into the business to produce steel rails and was able to drive down his costs through building large mills, by improving the machinery in the mills, by the way the mills were organized, and by just driving his machinery harder. Steel mills needed lots of iron that came out of the blast furnaces. There was another way to drive down your cost, which was to build your own blast furnaces. Rather than buying the iron on the open market from independent producers, is what people like Carnegie and the other steel mills did, is they built their own blast furnaces. The furnaces, which were built in the Pittsburgh area to a large extent, were fueled by soft coal, bituminous coal, not the old hard anthracite that was being used along the Atlantic seaboard. But it really wasn't coal. What was happening was the coal was being coked, slowly roasted to take out some of the gases. And by using coke in the blast furnace and through a number of other improvements in terms of the pressure of the air and using the waste gases to heat the air, is that blast furnaces could turn out much more iron per week at a somewhat lower cost, but mostly it was the increased volume that was needed than under the old methods. In the 1830s, a well-run blast furnace could turn out about 20 tons of iron a week. When anthracite coal came in, and some other improvements, by 1860, a best practices blast furnace could turn out about 70, 80 tons a week, a big increase in productivity. By 1900, the cumulative effect of productivities in blast furnaces owned by steel companies was leading to that many blast furnaces were now able to turn out 1,000 tons of iron a week. So major improvements, again, in productivity. By integrating the two, it was possible to, again, lower the cost of iron ore, lower transportation cost, obviously, if they're right next to the steel rolling mills, and to help drive down cost. And this was the dynamic that was running the steel industry. As supply expanded, as the growth in demand for steel rails slowed up in the 1890s and in the early 20th century, is that steel began to be used not as a substitute for existing products made out of irons, rails, machinery, but steel more and more was beginning to be used for new uses. They made possible, in fact, new uses. And the two new uses for steel both have had a tremendous impact on the 20th century in the way we live. The first one was the use of steel as structural steel. Steel represents the frame, the skeleton of modern urban skyscrapers. Without steel, it would not be possible to build the huge skyscrapers that dot the sky of all major American cities. And it was the coming of structural steel that, again, allowed architects to think about and then build these very, very tall buildings. Just changed the urban landscape, changed the way we work, it changed the environment in which we work. And all that was possible because of the ability to make large steel beams, the girders that go into the structure of modern skyscrapers. The other new use for steel was to roll very thin steel, sheet steel, and the major new demand for that was from the automobile industry. Car is basically an engine with a very thin steel skin wrapped around it, the body of the car. And over time, that became a major new business for the steel industry. So steel is a key component, skyscrapers and in automobiles. It is, in fact, really the basic material in the modern world. The second new industry that begins during this period is the petroleum or the oil industry. The modern history of oil refining begins just before the Civil War in 1859. A group of investors had heard that pools of oil were showing up with some frequency in areas in western Pennsylvania, northwest corner of Pennsylvania, and they bankrolled a man by the name of Colonel Drake, who was a phony. He wasn't a colonel, to go there and check it out and see if, in fact, he could develop this into some kind of business. And he did. He went there, was trying to figure out ways to kind of skim the oil off of the ponds. Obviously, this stuff was a pollutant. It polluted the water. Yucky stuff. So, but he felt that they knew there was, if they could find a lot of it in one place, if they could get it out cheaply, it could be refined, they could produce products with it. Well, Colonel Drake came up with a very clever idea. Instead of trying to come up with a technology that would just skim the oil off the top of the pools of water, the lakes, the streams, he reasoned that it had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was further down in the earth. And that really, most of the oil, in fact, was not at the surface, but was down somewhere inside the earth. How to get at it? Well, the only technology that was similar to what he had in mind was the technology to drill wells to find water. So that's what he did. He rented a water drilling well. That's why we still call them oil wells. And he drilled down, and on his first try, he hits oil. Lucky Colonel Drake. So it set off America's first oil boom, the first, in fact, of many. Immediately after that, people began staking out claims, and thousands of oil wells were drilled in this area in northwest Pennsylvania. Chaos. Hundreds, even thousands of small producers producing small volumes. Supply is almost random, depending on, of course, who drills where, how much comes up. Prices fall to the point where nobody's making any money. So this is an industry where there's a lot of chaos. And the man who figured out how to bring order from chaos and make himself maybe the richest man in America was John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller was an accountant, a young accountant in Cleveland, during the 1860s, Cleveland being near northwest Pennsylvania and one of the areas that the oil went to. And what John D. Rockefeller did was that he came into the business trying to control oil refining. He couldn't control the oil fields. There's too many people. They were finding oil all over the place. What he decided to do, the place to control the business was in the area of oil refining. And he spent 20 years trying to control oil refining, and he succeeded. By the 1880s, his company, Standard Oil, controlled most of the oil refining in America. But he did something else. He did two things that made Standard Oil such a big company and such a profitable company. The first thing he did was, again, to try to integrate the steps of the system, the same way that steel manufacturers went backwards to make iron ore and blast furnaces, and then later on they also went and started buying up companies that made coke from coal, and even later steel companies went even further and began to buy coal mines, they began to buy iron ore mines to try and control the whole process from the beginning, mining, all the way through, including transportation, to the final product, making steel rails or structural steel. Well, John D. Rockefeller tried to do somewhat the same thing in oil refining. Tried to control the distribution network, the oil pipelines from the fields to the oil refiners, and even tried at one point to control the actual drilling of oil. What he was able to do was to integrate the system to get the transportation and systems costs down, buy up other oil refiners, some of which he was not able to buy up. He was able to drive out of business through some fairly ruthless pricing. But in the end, Standard Oil, in fact, controlled most of the oil refineries and most of the system to get the oil from the well to the refinery in the United States. Rockefeller and Standard Oil then did something else. When he got control of all these little refineries, he closed them all down. They were small scale. What he did was he built 2 and then 3 very, very large refineries. He got tremendous economies of scale. He got his production costs per gallon down so he could lower the price, expand the market, justify these very large investments, being able to run lots of crude oil through these plants and then be able to sell them because the price was so low. By the way, one of these plants is still around here. If you're ever in Bayonne and have nothing better to do, Standard Oil's large plant, in fact, is still there, although it's no longer owned by Standard Oil or Standard Oil's predecessor, Exxon. Rockefeller and Standard Oil were so successful in improving the system, reducing production costs, and to some extent, not a lot, but some extent, improving management control, organization over the system, that he was able to very rapidly reduce the price of oil. In 1863, before this process began, the price of petroleum was about 36 cents a gallon. In 1885, where much of the system was in place, the price of oil had fallen to about 8 cents a gallon. The 2 major product lines of oil refining at the time were lubricants and kerosene. As more and more machines were built, as the machines got larger and faster, particularly because as the cutting edges of the machines and more of the moving parts began to be made out of steel, what was happening is that as these machines got larger, as they got faster, there was more friction as you had rapidly moving parts touching each other, and lubricating the parts became critical for getting these machines to run and not break down all the time. Well, the major lubricant before the coming of oil lubricants and grease, to a large extent, were animal fats. You'd slap on basically lard onto the moving parts, and of course that would help grease the parts. It didn't work particularly well, of course, with these heavy machinery with, again, fast moving parts. So there was a market for effective lubricants made out of petroleum, made out of crude oil, and that was a major market for Standard Oil, replacing animal fats. The other area was lighting. Before the coming of kerosene in the last part of the 19th century, major sources of lighting, particularly in homes, were candles. There's still a market for candles. But the other major source was whale oil. Well, whaling, of course, was a very big industry in the 19th century. In fact, went back to colonial times. The major reason for the existence of the whaling industry, capturing whales, was to get their oil, which was then sold, put in oil lamps, and of course burned for illumination. Just as an aside, the funny way things work is that, of course, we are worried about pollution from oil-based products, gasoline, diesel, things like that. However, if it wasn't for the coming of this new industry to produce these distilled, refined products, if we continued to rely on whale oil very much longer, the whales probably would have been wiped out. So these were 2 major and growing markets: kerosene for lighting, lubricants to lubricate machines. Funny thing happened to Standard Oil. In 1911, the U.S. government broke it up. It was one of the most successful antitrust, anti-monopoly prosecutions by the United States government under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Standard Oil was broken up into a number of companies, all of which are now very, very large companies, beside Exxon, Chevron, Amoco, Mobil, and the overseas Standard Oil companies. But, well, they were broken up just in time because a huge new source of demand was hitting the oil companies, was hitting Standard Oil. And of course, that new source of demand was for gasoline and diesel fuel for the rapidly expanding auto industry. But an interesting thing about Standard Oil in this story is that even before Standard Oil was broken up, Standard Oil was losing, and for 20 years had been losing, market share to other oil companies. And the reason for that was that there were new sources of crude oil, the huge new finds in Texas and California, and internationally huge new finds in other parts of the world. And Standard Oil could not control the production of crude oil. Other companies did, became the basis for companies like in the United States like Texaco, and companies in other countries such as Shell, Royal Dutch, which challenged Standard Oil in international markets. The third new technology that is going to transform the world is electricity. Well, when you say electricity, what you immediately comes to mind is Thomas Edison and the light bulb. Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb, but Thomas Edison improved it to such an extent that it became a practical commercial product, and he did this in the 1870s. But there's a problem. If you have a light bulb, it doesn't do you any good. All a light bulb does for you is it receives electricity. What makes the light is the electricity. The hard part is getting the electricity into the light bulb. And in order to do that, you have to develop an entire system in which the last step is running the wire into the house or the factory, into the light bulb or into the machine. And that's what Thomas Edison also did. He just didn't develop light bulbs, he developed an entire delivery system to deliver large amounts of electricity. He tried it out first as a pilot project in London, but the first real generator, real first power plant in America was designed and installed by Thomas Edison on Pearl Street, down near Wall Street, in New York in 1881. And there's a whole number of elements in this, dynamos, transmission lines, transformers, that all had to fit together as a system. Now, it turned out it wasn't the best system. There were better ways to do it. AC current was substituted for direct current, for example, which is what Edison liked. But that's not the point. The point really is that he saw it as a system and was able to do it in such a way to deliver a great deal of electricity for a wide number of uses. Electricity, of course, replaced kerosene and gas as a major form of lighting. But from our point of view, the other impact of electricity, it's going to become the major power source in manufacturing in the 20th century. Electricity is going to replace steam. By 1919 already, is that over half of all the power used in manufacturing now came from electricity. By 1929, 82% of all power used in manufacturing came from electricity. So electric power rapidly replaced steam as to drive machinery. This revolutionized production in three ways. First of all, that engineers now had much more latitude in how they designed the machines themselves, because they could use a fractional horsepower engine that could run on electricity. That meant that they could control how much power was going in the machine, which was very difficult to do using the system based on steam engines. The second thing they could do was they could now locate plants anywhere. They didn't have to depend on water power. They didn't have to depend on having sources of coal nearby. So whole industries began to shift. The cotton textile industry, which depended on water power in New England, at this point begins to shift down to the south. Part of the reason was that there was a power source, electricity, in the south. And the third thing was, and probably the most important, was now engineers could locate machinery anywhere in the plant. when steam engines were the major source of power, you had to line up machines in a row underneath the shaft that transmitted the power down to each machine. With electricity, you could put the machines anywhere and you could change them around. You could move the machines around as you improve the layout, as you improve the machines, as you change the production system. So it gave production engineers a great deal of flexibility and is one of the reasons for the large productivity growth in manufacturing in the 1920s. The other application, of course, was in the home. As, of course, electricity has transformed the way we live. And this already began in the 1920s. This is really the first decade where there are large sales of home appliances run on electricity. Probably the one product that was probably they sold more of in the 1920s was not refrigerators or some of the other home appliances, but in fact were radios, and I'd like to talk about that 2 lectures from now. So these 3 radical new technologies transforming the way we live. And we could think of them in terms of manufacturing, at least, of how they interacted. Steel allows you to make bigger machines, faster machines, more precise cutting edges. These bigger, faster machines are more productive because they're going to be run on electricity. Again, you can move them around, you can change the machine, you can change your whole production process. And you can't run these machines efficiently unless they're lubricated with the new, better lubricants based on petroleum rather than animal and vegetable fats. So there's synergy involved here too. So we have a world from the supply side, economies of scale, large-scale production, integration of systems to cut down on transportation and coordination costs, and then new uses because there are cheaper, larger supplies available. And then these technologies interact to produce even new ways of the way we live, produce new products such as the automobile. I would like to take another look at this period of approximately 1870 to 1914. I would like to take a look at it from the other side of the market, from the demand side. And so here what we have are problems of mass marketing. This is the marketing side, more fun probably than the production or supply side of the market. Well, last time before that talked about the rise of large-scale production as these new methods were brought in, new materials brought in, huge increases in the amount of goods that are being produced, and in many cases at lower and lower prices. Well, that was only part of the problems of the people who were running these large companies. You could control production. You could schedule production. But many of these companies began to run into 2 sets of problems. The first one was coordinating production with purchasing, the buying of raw materials, sub-assemblies, intermediate goods, whatever. You could buy these raw materials on the open market. If you were, for example, a flour miller, there was a very well-organized market where you could buy wheat, the raw material for making your flour, so that the products were available. The problem was coordinating the purchasing with production. There were problems of buying the right quantity of the raw material at the right time. There were problems with fluctuating quality, which affected how efficiently you operated your plants and what your final product looked like. There might, if there's seasonality in prices, there might be a problem with pricing. And you really needed a lot of the raw material. It was the very time of the year when they were most expensive. There might be problems with getting enough transportation to move the raw material to your plant. Problems of storage. A number of problems involved when you bought raw materials on the open market, on the spot market. What a number of companies did is they tried to integrate backward to try to control at least some of their purchases of inputs, of raw materials. Steel companies bought, again, iron ore mines. They bought coal mines. They bought barge companies. They bought railroads. They bought companies that made coke from coal. So they tried to control as much of the process into the plant as they could. And there was a number of moves in a number of other industries to do this. Some manufacturers, again, tried to directly buy up the raw material right at the control of the source. Oil companies that tried to own oil wells. Aluminum companies, that Alcoa, that bought up every new bauxite site, the source of aluminum. So that was one set of problems. The second set of problems was selling the product. Huge increase in production, huge increase in output, and what a number of companies, the problem they began to run across towards the end of the 19th century is industry supply as big new plants were being built, lots of new capacity coming on stream. As industry supply was growing faster than demand. That created the problem of selling. Well, the traditional way you sold the product was that you contracted with independent reps, you contracted with local wholesalers, some of whom were wholesalers and retailers who would sell your product, sometimes would sell your product and competing products. They would concentrate sometimes in a product line, a product area, rather than by company. They would then redistribute the products to a large number of small stores in their marketing area. You had no control over that. You had no control over the independent distributors, the wholesalers, the retailers. You, in effect, were at their mercy. Now, a company like Singer, of course, short-circuited all that by setting up their own stores. But there was a special reason, is that they also had to educate potential customers on how to use sewing machines. They had to have classes. They had to provide a number of services to potential customers. It was also where if your machine broke down, you had to have a place to bring your machine to get it repaired. So a number of companies ran across this problem was that they found it difficult to coordinate production with selling. And remember, in order to make money, you've got to run a lot of raw material through your plant. You've got to produce a high volume at low unit cost. That means you have to sell a high volume. You don't want it just stacked up in inventory somewhere. So more and more companies were faced with this problem of how do you sell the stuff, these rapidly increasing volumes of products, consumer goods particularly. Well, the market was expanding. It wasn't like you were trying to sell more to a stagnant market. A rapid increase in population, a rapid increase in income. But it wasn't just the size of the market that was changing. It was the structure of the market that was changing, because at the same time, America was rapidly urbanizing. Where the big growth was were in urban markets. And your customers, if you were selling consumer products, ready-made clothes, certain kinds of food, number of leisure goods, your customers were changing. Because more and more, your market, the people who bought your products, were a rapidly increasing, in some ways new group of customers. These were urban, middle-class women who had education, they were literate, they had at least some leisure, and certainly more than, say, a woman on a farm, and they had money. So this was a new group of customers. And how do you sell to them? How do you market this rapidly growing supply of consumer goods to this market? What came out of this, just as facing production coordination problems led to mass production, what came out of this was mass merchandising, the kind of way products are marketed and sold today. And the key to this was a new way to sell products. And that new way to sell products was through a department store. This was an innovation of this period. The first department store, well, there's a lot of controversy on what was the first department store. Probably the first recognizable department store, in fact, wasn't American. The first one was probably Bon Marché in France. Department stores, however, didn't really catch on very much in Europe for a variety of social reasons, and the first big department stores, to a large extent, really catered not to the masses. They really catered to the new upper middle class. They used phrases like the democratization of luxury. In other words, these were styles that the upper classes were adopting, and then they would filter down to the upper middle class that had enough money, again, to buy the relatively expensive products. Bon Marché, some of these are still with us. Bon Marché, Galeria Lafayette, which at one time had a store in Trump Tower. This is not your French version of Kmart. Harrods, Selfridges. But when the department store was developed in America, the social system was different. The income was more equally distributed. There was a larger market. There were more people that could, more families that in fact could afford some of the new convenience goods, some of the new leisure goods that were being produced. So American department stores did not just cater to the upper middle class. In fact, they were much more democratic. They were willing to sell products to anybody who could afford to come in and buy them. And they carried such a wide variety of products that just about anybody, in fact, could find something in a department store. The first recognizable department store in the United States was put up by a man by the name of A.T. Stewart in 1846 down at the corner of Chamber and Broadway. It was a roaring success. It was a large store. Most stores were very small, tend to be dark. And what evolved was the modern department store with a number of innovations that were brought together. The first thing was the store itself was attractive. This was a large store, a dome through the middle of it, a rotunda, lots of light, plate glass windows, which were possible because of some of the new building techniques. A lot of light. A lot of people in the cities, of course, spend most of their time in fairly dark, dingy apartments or dark, dingy factories. And being able to walk into a well-lit department store was part of the pleasure of shopping. So that was the first thing. The store itself was attractive. You went to the store to see the store, to be in this attractive store. The second thing was the organization of the products into, not surprisingly, departments. Is that it wasn't all just jumbled up. Is that you knew if you wanted to buy something, you could tell very easily where to go, and you could find a wide variety of the product in one place. The next innovation was the products had prices on them, and that was very important. If you went into a fancy shop, there was no prices on the product. The carriage trade, people who own carriages come and stop in front of these shops. There were no prices on the product. So particularly if you didn't have a lot of money, you could be embarrassed. You could say, oh, I really want to buy that dress, and then you find out it's too expensive and you can't afford it. Well, you weren't embarrassed in a department store because all the products had the prices right there on the product. You could tell right away without asking someone whether or not you could afford to buy it. There also was service. This is something department stores today have forgotten what made them rich to start with, which was service. Lots and lots and lots of service. Excuse me, sales clerks who knew the merchandise, who could answer questions. A number of other services related to shopping. For example, books were a major product line in these stores, so there would be a reading room, kind of like what Barnes & Noble has gotten back to today. A place you could sit down and read through a book, things like that. So shopping became the kind of experience, and the fact that it is still today. It wasn't just going to buy something, but in fact it was a pleasurable experience. Retailers understood the social side. The good retailers understood the social side of retailing, of mass retailing, that this was also not just people coming to buy products, but was a social and leisure experience. Some retailers understood that department stores, in fact, perform some of the functions of community centers, an idea that is carried over into suburban shopping malls. So attract a lot of customers, Nice store, lots of merchandise. You sell it at relatively low prices with low markups, and you hope for very high turnover. It's mass merchandising. You can move a lot of product through a department store. So the department store owners could then go back to the big manufacturers and say, look, I can move a lot of your product, but you have to give me a discount. You don't have to deal with a lot of independent guys and have all the cost involved with that. You sell a lot of your product to me, I can sell it through my store, but you have to give me a discount. You've got to pass on some of your cost savings to me. I'll pass them on to my customers. Low prices, low markups. We'll push a lot of product. High turnover. And it worked, not surprisingly. A.T. Stewart then built a second store in New York in 1862, which became like the model for the urban department store. It was built out of cast iron on the outside. It was built in such a way, large plate glass windows, again, for display, although he didn't believe in display, to allow light in, a big glass dome once more, a lot of light inside, well-organized departments. That building, by the way, was built, it's still there, it was built between Broadway and 4th Avenue, which is now Lafayette, near Astor Place, between 9th and 10th. And the reason I know that, the fact that that building is still there, is that a few years ago my wife worked in that building, and neither of us realized this was A.T. Stewart's department store. It finally dawned upon me what this building was. By then it had been changed so much. It was an office building owned by American Express. It was hard to really get a feel for how it was constructed or how it functioned as a department store. Department stores caught on. They were very profitable, and they were able to, again, fill the needs of this new, relatively affluent group of customers who still, however, did not feel comfortable going into the small boutiques. At the same time, of course, were able to solve the problems of the large producers by moving great amounts of good through department stores. Early department stores are still with us today. Wanamaker's was the one I'm going to talk about. Roland Macy. Lord & Taylor was one of the first. Bloomingdale's, Jordan Marsh, Edward Filene, Marshall Fields. Many of these chains go back well over 100 years. Now, John Wanamaker in Philadelphia probably took this concept further than most, because what Wanamaker did is he created demand. He didn't wait for customers to come into a store. He created demand. And he did it the same way department stores do it today. His major innovation was the newspaper ad. That was possible because the price of newspapers had come way down because of technological innovation in the making of paper, made from cheap wood pulp as opposed to rags, and a whole series of innovations in printing, which allowed just about anybody to afford a newspaper. It became a form of mass communication. The second form of mass communication at the time, by the way, were magazines. Mass circulation magazines were coming at this time. And so, interestingly enough, the ones with the largest circulation were aimed at women, as of course were the department stores. And Wanamaker took advantage of this. Substantial newspaper advertising to tell people what his new products were, to create demand, to show people what new styles were. He subsidized advice columns to tell people what the new styles were, things like that. In fact, the first advertising agency in the United States was created in Philadelphia in the 1870s in order to write the ad copy for Wanamaker's newspaper ads. But he went further than that. He sponsored all kinds of promotions, including some that were very similar to the Macy's Day Parade. So this idea that you create demand, you create excitement, you tell people about new products, you create new styles so people feel that their old products are out of style, and they throw them out and buy new products that are more in style. All these things became part of mass merchandising of department stores in the last quarter, actually the last half of the 19th century. So that was one solution to the problem of how do you sell this great increase in supply of consumer goods. The second approach was, you can think of that as the sales approach, By the way, there was one interesting consequence of all this. The vast majority of shoppers in the department stores, which were open during the day, were women. And what this did in America, and this was different than in the rest, and then in Europe and the rest of the world, what it did in America is that it created a downtown space where the department stores were, where they tended to cluster. It created a downtown space where there were a lot of women, and that was something very unusual because the city was a place where there were factories, was a place where there were warehouses, there were offices. To a large extent, during the day, cities were places that were dominated by men and dominated by business. The streets, always a bunch of guys hanging out on the streets, guys going up and down in wagons, things like that. It was always men. And for the first time, this created kind of a female space in cities with some interesting consequences to how we think about urban space and how we think about cities. So there were some social consequences. There's also, some people believe that this also helped with the emancipation of women by allowing them an activity for women to along with some of the other new activities, women's club, an interest in reform, things like that, that created for the first time really in an urban setting a public space for women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, for example, understood what were some of the consequences of an urban space for women. The second approach to this problem of how do you push, how do you sell lots of products was what we now would call marketing. Companies began to do all those things that we all are familiar with, for better or for worse. They began for the first time to put a brand name on the product. You just didn't sell oats, you sold Quaker Oats. And then you, of course, advertised and promoted the hell out of it to convince everybody that Quaker Oats was better than somebody else's rolled oats. Packaging became important because one of the problems that people had in urban areas was space. They lived in small apartments. Oats used to be sold in 25 and 50-pound bags. Grain in general, in fact, was sold in large bags. You couldn't sell a 50-pound bag to someone who had a small apartment. So what Quaker Oats did was come up with their famous cylinder. Because it was small, you could sell a really small amount, put it on a shelf, didn't take up too much space. So packaging became important, size of the package. And then, of course, you could put your name on the package. Promotion. Companies like Quaker did all those things we're familiar with today. They had celebrities endorse the product. They had doctors say about how you're going to live longer and be healthier if you use the product. And on, all the stuff that we're familiar with today. In fact, Quaker Oats was the first company to put a little prize inside the box. All that stuff breakfast cereal companies do today was all done by Quaker. They sponsored events, various kinds of sporting events, like later on car races. So all that kind of marketing that is there today really evolved, really began. This type of mass marketing really began during this period. Much more sophisticated ads in magazines, for example, things like that. So mass marketing, creating demand. Mass merchandising, being able to sell a large amount of product, low markup, but high turnover, was really the market side answer to this problem of large-scale production and then how to move out the product. And again, it kind of changed, certainly it changed the environment in which we live. So the urban environment physically changed, again, because of the coming of department stores, and the way products are sold changed. And most of those changes were already in place by 1900.